Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about The Goldfinch by Tartt. This 2013 novel generated a cantankerous debate in the world of literary criticism over the quality of fiction and how we define it. We look at Tartt's writing process and themes to try to understand whether this book deserved the praise and awards it received.
You can find our show notes at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave a comment or you can write us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Did you read this? Did you read the whole thing? And did you like it? Chris, before the show starts, I think we should take care of some business.
I think we should too. So, listeners, we have decided that after 4 full years of doing this show, we're going to retire regular episodes of Super Context in May of 2020.
We're letting you know here because our Patreon supporters already have heard from us, and we've had discussions on the Patreon page, patreon.com/supercontext. But we don't want this to be a surprise to any of our regular listeners. So this is just to let you know, the next few months, we're going to hit as many of the gotta do it subjects as we can before we cease production, probably mid-May of this year.
Yeah, we wanted to give everybody a heads up before the show ended. So we've got 5 more months of episodes. By my count, that's almost 20 episodes before we retire the show. Look, I just want to say that doing the show has been really rewarding, especially being able to expand it by having a patron. But unfortunately, the production schedule has just been unsustainable for the two of us. We've got things to maintain due to our day jobs, our families, and all of our other creative projects. If you want more information about what we're going to do with the show after May, keep listening to the episode, and at the Patreon spot in the middle, we'll throw down some more information. Charlie, what is the plan that you and your wife have for if you both die and the kids need to be taken care of?
Okay. They have technically what a godparent is, or godparents are. They're not godparents, though, because we didn't do it through the church or anything like that. But yes, they have relatives that they go to. And I am quite insured in many ways. And through my work, so is my wife.
So they're not going to live in my basement with me?
You are going to live in their basement once they establish a house.
As long as somebody's living in a basement.
Yeah. They'll have a crawl space all for you. They'll even throw some spiders down there for you.
As I was reading The Goldfinch, I was thinking about stuff like this, about my friends who have kids like yourself, and the task it must be to try to determine, like, who is it who will do the best job of raising our children if we are gone, to ensure that they don't steal paintings, become drug addicts, and illegal furniture dealers. It's an amazing
thing, too. Like, gosh, how far in detail can I go here? There is a clear choice. You know, there's only one relative, direct relative who already has a family, who's already raising kids and dove into that, know? Mm-hmm. And everybody else is, a bachelor or brain damaged. And so, we can't ask any of those to step up. And then our parents are older. There's not there's Mississippi deep family, right? But there's not a lot of extension from our family into the who will take care of the kids thing. It is interesting to think about how the person that we've chosen is not there, right? Mm-hmm. So if we, as my parents once said, if we go up in a fireball on the highway, call this lawyer, and then, they'll contact your legal guardian.
Mm-hmm.
But there would be a gap. Ooh, my heart rate just went up thinking about the actual event.
So you can think of why Donna Tartt would choose such a topic as the hook for her novel, right? Like the idea of, we're going to do a coming of age story, and it's going to be from the child's point of view as they are shuffled back and forth between different surrogate parents after one of their parents violently dies.
Well, I was thinking about Roald Dahl and how he orphans most of his kids' book characters sort of right away. Get the parents out of the way so that you can then send them on adventures.
Yeah.
And in this, it was, let's orphan the kid in order to dig deep on the idea of how we imagine values, how we approach the world, how we decide what makes us good or what we're going to hold ourselves to.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting conceit, especially for something that was, how do I put this, expected to be a literati darling.
Yeah.
There was a lot of expectation both around Tartt and whatever she would produce next. And so let's ground this for the audience. This is our big book of the year episode. We have done books like Gravity's Rainbow in the past, Infinite Jest,
Always Coming Home.
Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin. And so this year we chose the Goldfinch. We didn't really do a full year reading. I think we've probably had about 3 months maybe since we decided on it. I will cop immediately to not finishing this. So this time the roles are switched because I only got, according to my Kindle, 58% of the way through this book. Not because I didn't like it, but because it was a behemoth and I ran out of time.
Yeah, the paperback version is like 831 pages.
Right. So I read 1 or 2 novels worth of page count, but I just didn't read the whole thing of this.
And as I said to you, I read it, but I read it fast.
Yeah, it is a very skimmable book.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a
not
good or
difficult.
a bad thing.
Well, Gravity's Rainbow, Infinite Jest, Always Coming Home, something that connected all of those was a kind of impenetrability of the ideas and the prose. And this novel is exceedingly readable.
Mm-hmm.
It is luxurious in its prose. There's just a shit ton of it.
And I'm going to say the disparaging thing right now that I think a lot of people may be thinking, and we're certainly going to call to mind when we spend time looking all the reviews that battled out over whether this was a good or a bad book. There is an assumption that this is a book that is designed to be a, quote, literary book, a big book for soccer moms to read on the beach.
That this is a market-tested, consumer-driven, artistic half-statement?
I don't think it is from Tartt, but I think there is an assumption
that's the accusation.
That the publishing industry has, that's how they approach selling this. And this is going to weirdly echo another episode that we have done, but I am going to be on the other side of the argument this time, surprisingly. So we did, what was it, like a year and a half, 2 years ago, an episode about Jennifer Egan's Welcome to the Goon Squad. And if you want to go back and listen to that episode, I despised that book. And I accused that book in that episode of all of the things that people are about to accuse the Goldfinch of in this episode. And I don't know that I agree with them here.
It is remarkable that despite this enormous book and its globe-trotting plot and its, maximalist prose about an emotional landscape and a desire for meaning and just how rich the book is, what it created as a cultural conversation was, is it literature? Is it a kid's book? Should we let businesses decide what book is important? There's really not that much engagement with what the book is delivering.
Right. And to a certain extent, that's how we're going to handle it too, but we're going to talk more about how Donna Tartt wrote it, what her goals were when she wrote it, how the publishing industry put it out in the world, how it was received, which was very polarized. And then we're going to talk about what the actual like core identity of this book is and the themes that either resonated with people and they loved it or really triggered them and they hated it.
And that part's going to get a little bit aggressive and dark.
Yeah, because not only are the theme, she's aiming for the fences here. These are big themes, but they are dismissed pretty casually by some folks at the same time as being embraced by others.
Okay. So, The Goldfinch, a 2013 novel by the author Donna Tartt, who is an American writer who has written 3 books over 30-ish years. She's known for The Secret History, her first book, The Little Friend, which was a successful book that did not have the splash that the first book did.
It wasn't critically acclaimed, yeah.
Yeah. And this book, The Goldfinch, which was recently made into a movie.
So I have read The Secret History. Have you read either of those 2 books?
Nope.
Okay.
I never heard of Donna Tartt until Goldfinch came out, and my wife read it. And and now I'm learning all kinds of stuff about her.
I was a fan of The Secret History. I read it while I was touring Europe in my early 20s. And
is that because there's murder in it, Chris?
Oh, I love a good murder story. No. It is less a murder mystery than it is about it. Well, it's another coming of age story. It's more about a group of kids growing up while they're taking classical Greek. Yeah. But there is murder involved as well.
Now, Donna Tartt is from Mississippi. She lives in Virginia and splits her time between Virginia and New York, I think. But she was born and raised in Greenwood, Mississippi, which is one of the smaller towns in Mississippi.
You would know far better than I would, yeah.
I mean, if there's 3 tiers, if there's the big cities and then the cities and then the small cities, she's from a small city, although I think maybe 10,000 people is a town, and Greenwood is just a little bit bigger than that. Anyway, she's from where Morgan Freeman is from, and Robert Johnson.
How do you know all this stuff? Because it's not in our notes.
I have been looking into Mississippi, and I had to check, but yeah, that's I know that about Mississippi. How do I know? I know things, man. They hide this information in books, and then I find it.
You just casually know stuff about small towns in Mississippi. It's shocking.
You know who I married, right?
I do.
You know where I
spend. The audience
does.
That's what I was trying to get you to cop to. Okay. So this is the first novel that Tartt has written since 2002. So it came out in, what did we say, 2013?
2013.
So 11-ish, 10 years were spent working on this thing. And that's going to be important to how we talk about it, and I think how other people talk about it probably as well. Let's go right to Tartt and get some quotes from her first about how she approaches writing and what her like kind of tics are with writing, and then how she specifically approached this book. We should mention the media often refers to Tartt as a recluse because she only does interviews every 10 years when she has a book out.
And she's like Thomas Pynchon in that she's not a recluse. She just doesn't like to talk to the media.
Well, she's not like Thomas Pynchon in that we know what she looks like, and there are a lot of photos of her, and she has been in the limelight. But yeah, I would say Thomas Pynchon is far more of a recluse than Donna Tartt.
Perhaps what I should say is that the connection I was trying to make is that Pynchon has friends and a social life and is known to be out in the world.
Yeah.
Recluse implies hiding away from everyone.
Yeah.
The media calls a person a recluse when they don't want to talk to the media.
That is fair. So a couple things. There was a Donna Tartt listicle that I found. And at first I was like, I don't know about this, if this is going to be of any use. And then I was shocked. There were some great quotes from her in there. So I'm going to turn to some of this stuff. One of the things is that she is apparently strongly influenced by both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Peter Pan.
So let me tee this up real quick. We have mentioned that The Secret History and The Goldfinch are coming-of-age stories. We've talked about orphaning kids. She's very attached to Peter Pan. The quote you found is, "There's something of Peter Pan in every single thing I've written. It's there in everything, very, very deeply. Peter Pan was the first book I loved that I read to myself. It was a drug, an altered state of consciousness. You weren't at your school. You were really somewhere else."
So she seems to be really interested in literary influences that are from a different time, not from present-day literary influences, because the next person she cites as being a huge influence is Charles Dickens, and we are going to hear his name over and over and over again in this episode. She talked to the Irish Independent at one point and said, "Oliver Twist was the first book I read with real blood and death in it. I would worry about Oliver all day while I was at school." We're starting already to hear that she has like a very intense relationships with the books while she's a child. Mm-hmm. And then she talks about how it relates to the Goldfinch, and she says the character of Theo, his setup is Dickensian. I love Dickens a lot and just kind of internalize him.
I'm going to go out on a limb. If she grew up in the 80s in Mississippi or the 70s in Mississippi.
Yeah. I think she's a little older than we are, so probably the 70s, yeah.
Yeah. It's not like Mississippi is some kind of foreign country, with a customs that stops things from getting there. But there is a bit of cultural isolationism in Mississippi, deep South places that can really show up in the way that school curriculum are created. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
right,
Charles
they're probably
Dickens,
not teaching, that year's New York Times bestseller.
Right, and they're not grabbing postmodern literature or feminist literature from the recent years. They're going to go after the canon. They're going to use, Peter Pan and Charles Dickens as substantial parts of an English curriculum.
Mm-hmm. So she turns to talking about how she writes. And no surprise, a person who took 10 years to write a book, although let's be fair, it's 800 pages. She says that she has a long writing process that's really intricate. And she says she just writes all the time. She compares it to being like a pianist with scales or an artist with a sketchbook. She says it usually takes her about 10 years per novel. She writes by hand at first, and she makes notes in blue pencil, stapling note cards to pages. And when the note cards start to fall apart, then she prints out drafts. And each draft is then printed on a corresponding shade of paper. I have an anecdote about this. I recently met a published novelist. I'll confess I haven't read any of their works, which is why I'm not going to use their name. But we were talking backstage when I had met them. This was through my previous job. And they said, yeah, I get up in the morning and my process is I write everything by hand until lunchtime. And then I break for lunch, and then I come back and I type the second draft into the computer. Mm-hmm. She said that she feels like she uses a different part of her brain when she's writing by hand. And then the typing part is also part of her drafting and editing and making the words and the sentences better.
That makes total sense to me. The thing that this made me think of was Philip Roth. When I finally read a literary biography of Philip Roth that discussed his process, like his actual operational writing procedures, they talked about how he would write all day and maybe throw away all the pages, only keeping a paragraph or a page or a few notes, and that was perfectly fine for him.
Yeah.
He was writing constantly to get at the small bits and pieces that were useful. And so her saying she writes all the time like a pianist with scales or an artist with a sketchbook, working out ideas, practicing and seeing what pops up, almost entering that kind of improv dream state where you're practicing and then something interesting pops into your ritualistic practice.
Yeah, it's something I've been trying to incorporate more into my practice, or at least how I edit. I don't write by hand, but I'm always interested to hear about stuff like this. She talks specifically about the Goldfinch. We'll hear this over and over again. that she first got the idea when she actually saw the painting that the book is named after. Is it Fabritius? Is that how you say his name?
That is good enough for me.
Painter. And she saw it while she was in Holland, while she was on tour for The Secret History. And she got the idea for this book then. The painting compelled her to gaze up yearningly at it.
Yeah, it was hung above her eye line, and this was the start of the idea. And hey, I think we should probably at least explain the setup and why this painting is the Goldfinch of the novel.
Sure.
I don't want to make fun of the book, but I will say that the summary I'm about to deliver of the opening scene, it takes about 80 to 100 pages for all of this to happen.
Yeah, the hook of the story is not delivered until you're a tenth of the way through the book.
Yeah. So Theo is a kid who is on the edge when it comes to suspensions and bad behavior at school, and his mom is forced to go in with him to a teachers conference. They live in New York. It's a very rainy day. They can't get a taxi, or the taxi they get is crazy and makes her sick. And the mom says, "We're getting out. We're going to go kill time in this museum." She walks her son through the museum talking about painting and how much she likes it, like the actual discipline of painting and its history. She talks about the painting The Goldfinch. And then the museum blows up, and in the chaos and sort of mental disarticulation that he experiences after the explosion, he's goaded into stealing the painting, The Goldfinch, by a sort of ghostly, also out of touch figure in the museum. He steals the painting and finds out that his mother has died in this museum bombing.
Yeah. In retrospect, while I was reading it, I didn't really think this, but stepping back and thinking about the plot, it is a very manufactured idea that this child would steal the painting and bring it home and hide it before he would talk to the authorities after surviving a bombing in a public place like a museum. But it seems to work in the context of the story.
One of the tricks of the novel seems to be the thoroughness that she writes these events with is almost a justification for these outlandish plot twists. You know, following the thought process for pages upon pages to get someone to deciding to walk through a door almost fools the reader into not questioning, is that really something they would do?
Yeah, that is a good point, Charlie. Do you want us to describe the rest of the plot, or should we?
Nope. I don't even want to try, because eventually we get to the point where we're just saying, and then he's doing heroin, and then he steals some stuff, and then he goes to Amsterdam, and then everybody thinks about what life is. And I just don't want to do any of that kind of plotting.
Let's go back to Tartt then, talking about one of the reasons why she doesn't like doing book tours or interviews. She says it's because book tours distract her, and that she prefers to be at home getting to work and writing the books that she's doing rather than talking about the books that she's done. She says it's counterproductive. I'd go mad if I had to go on a book tour every 2 years. I'd go completely berserk. I can just about handle it once every decade. And she says she doesn't go to literary galas or things like that. She says, look, that doesn't make me a recluse. She compares herself somewhat to Joan Didion. Joan Didion is a bit of a hero for her, and somebody who I think that she's become friends with as well.
She refers to Joan Didion writing a beautiful essay about Howard Hughes, who was a lonely recluse, but also a kind of weird American hero who built the whole city of Las Vegas. And Joan Didion says, he's the last private man, the dream we no longer admit.
So then we get to the point where she actually starts doing interviews about the content in The Goldfinch. And this is a good point for me to throw down a bias I had against this book and then that I turned around on. As I first started reading this book, I would text Charlie and I would be like, I don't have the patience to read a book about how hard the lives of rich people in New York are.
Yeah, that was a really big piece of it. There was a kind of like, this is so manufactured.
Yeah.
Sort of resistance for you. Like, oh, poor little rich boy, they had to kill his mom to make anything a problem for him.
Yeah, and I'm clearly not the only one. This comes up again later in the notes when other people reviewing it are talking about the themes. This book starts with a kid that I would say is upper middle class, in that he lives in New York City and lives comfortably with his mother, who is some kind of art director for a marketing agency, right? They are by no means poor.
Yeah.
They go to the museum all the time and go out for dinner.
Their building has a doorman and everything.
Yeah. And then his mother dies, and he goes to live with a fabulously wealthy family, like an incredibly rich family. And that is a good 200, 300 pages of the book, him living with them and how hard their lives are. And then he goes to live in Las Vegas with his father, and they are also, I wouldn't call them wealthy, but his father's a gambling addict, and he uses the cash that he gets to live in like a prefab suburban neighborhood. There isn't really any point where poverty itself is explored, but this book is about class. It's just about different striations of class in the middle to upper to 1% range. And at first it felt to me like this was a book where she wasn't conscious of her own privilege. And again, other people are going to accuse her of this in the notes later on. But it took a good 300 or 400 pages, but I got to a point where I was like, oh, I see. No, she is trying to comment on privilege. But her position from a place of privilege, I think, makes it vaguer than I would have liked it to be. And this is the evidence I have for saying this. So
this interview, the description of Tartt and the way what the interviewer decides to write about in her meeting with Tartt.
So this is for Town and Country, Charlie.
Well, there's a start to understanding this person.
Donna Tartt met this journalist in the lobby of the Soho Grand Hotel in New York City, which is a place that she lives in half the time. She splits her time between living in the Soho Grand Hotel and her, quote, dacha in rural Virginia.
Her country cottage, Chris.
Mm-hmm. And this, very much like within the Goldfinch, all the staff who worked at the Soho Grand knew her and were friendly with her and liked her.
Yeah, the writer points out that she seems to connect with everybody. She's not in any way aloof.
She's not snobbishly elitist.
Yeah. And she doesn't come in saying, I don't do interviews, you're lucky to have me. Right. Like she is charming to the interviewer,
she's not Vincent
too.
Gallo.
Right. So here's a little chunk from this article, this interview article. I'm a bit of a lone wolf, the 49-year-old Tartt says in a southern lilt, her green eyes shining and her porcelain skin flawless. I don't give interviews or do publicity unless I have a book out. It's too distracting. My desk is where the real work happens. So that is like that's like a perfect summation of Tartt's image. Right? I saw an article where someone wrote the headline, who else wants to trade bodies with Donna Tartt?
Oh, really? Okay, well, this is a good point then for me to bring up something that I noticed. Something that is, if you read between the lines in the way that people write about Donna Tartt, clearly something we're all thinking about, but isn't directly addressed often, which is that she is a very pretty human being, and she is very put together, and clearly has a sense of fashion, and I don't know what the right word is for this, Charlie, like body care. Like, she takes care of, like this person points out, she has flawless porcelain skin, like she has these immaculate haircuts, her makeup is always perfect. Like these are things, again, like I pointed this out when you mentioned Thomas Pynchon, there's like 1,000 pictures of Donna Tartt out there at events wearing quaint little suits. Yeah.
When she does her press tours, it's not like she hides. Like she truly does them. there's actually in this article a long quote from her that sort of lays out the philosophy she has behind not really doing a lot of, hey, a conversation with Donna Tartt, in between her books.
Yeah.
She says, I don't think it's a good idea for a writer to psychoanalyze herself or try to explain why she writes what she writes. It's a reductive way of looking at oneself and one's work. Readers really participate in the writing of a book. As a writer, I'm giving the reader signs to help create the story with me. The reader is bringing his or her own memories, intelligence, preconceptions, prejudices, likes, dislikes. So the characters in your copy of the book are going to look and sound different than in mine. I have my own ideas, but once the book is out there, it's not really mine anymore. And my own idea isn't any more valid than yours. And then I begin the long process of disengaging.
So that, I think, is important because we're going to find that readers did engage with this, whether they were a casual audience, whether they were Tartt fans or members of the literary criticism community. And everybody had a different, strong opinion about this book. The one thing that I keep coming back to, Charlie, is this is a book for 10 years. She got up every day and she worked on a little bit and she thought about it and she thought about the themes or the characters or what was important to her for a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems both difficult and surprisingly easy for her to say, like, after I worked on this thing for a decade, it is now just out in the world and it's out of my control. It's no longer mine.
Well, let me add two things to that. It's even longer than a decade because she said it was on the Secret History book tour that she got the first idea. So that means that the work on the book was even more than just when she was sitting down writing. Like, she was living with these ideas for as long as she was.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing comes from that article that we've been quoting from just now. She has a idea of the writer's life, which is very distinct. Or she has an idea of the writer's project, which is very distinct. She said she always knew she wanted to be a writer. As soon as she realized that people wrote books and that they were made, she started trying to make her own. She says, as soon as I understood that books were manufactured objects and not magical emanations issuing directly from Oz or whatever, I started trying to illustrate my own books on stapled construction paper.
I think that's a really important quote because it kind of gets to the heart of what we try to do with the show. It's the demystification of these artifacts that we're presented with, because it's real easy to pick up a book like The Goldfinch and to be like, oh, this just kind of sprang like Athena out of the brow of some genius.
What I pull from this, though, also is a kind of privileging of the object as the end result.
Yeah.
This is
what
the reader gets. Yeah. And then she says that she concentrated on 19th century novelists like Dickens, Stevenson, Conrad, Woodhouse, and Nabokov. I don't know if that's 19th century. And then
maybe he was born in the 19th century.
Maybe,
I don't know when he was born.
But she looked back to a time when press was not about trying to get the inner life of a writer. They were not being turned into celebrities. They were the names on the book that was arriving in the reader's hands in their life, but the writer themselves was not being put into people's lives. Certainly not being pushed, through social media.
So there's somewhat of a precedent for this, Charlie, with her, because she went to school with Bret Easton Ellis, and they both published books young. And so I think the media immediately leapt on creating a narrative around their relationship, the time they spent together as young people, and what that meant for young geniuses putting books out into the world.
Yeah, and it's a nice pairing, too, because Bret Easton Ellis is completely attached to maintaining an image and an identity and parasocial relationships versus Tartt basically saying, nope, I'm out. Mm-hmm. Not even talking about other writers in her interviews because she says that would be gossipy.
I wonder if there's a comparison to be made between the two of them, Truman Capote and Harper Lee, It's a bit of a stretch, but it's
I think it's
to mind.
I think it's too much of a stretch. Actually, I don't think you can look at their work and find those sort of intertwined interests.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and certainly the whole one and done aspect of Harper Lee's career kind of pushes her out of the the comparison. Here is a version of the official story of how they met and who they are to each other. So she went to Ole Miss for a little while in Mississippi, and then she was advised to transfer to Bennington by Willie Morris, who is a writer and editor. And Bennington is where this writing program was that Bret Easton Ellis was. There, quote, Tartt immediately hit it off with fellow student Bret Easton Ellis over their mutual love of Joan Didion, and Ellis ultimately introduced her to Urban, who represented him, so a literary agent. The Secret History took Tartt a decade to write, garnered her a $450,000 advance, sold out its initial print run of 75,000, and went on to be published in 30 languages.
I don't know what the actual story is between them, and it's not necessarily relevant to the Goldfinch. I would note that when she talks about why she doesn't talk about other living writers, she refers to it as being gossipy, probably because she feels the same way when people talk about her and Ellis. I just remember when I read The Secret History, there was a lot of to-do about their relationship and about how they did or did not help each other be better writers.
You know, there's a quote here from the executive vice president at Knopf when the book was published, Paul Bogards, who said...
The Secret History, not the Goldfinch.
Yeah, Secret History, who said, "We positioned The Secret History as a bestseller from the outset, and the response from booksellers and readers was immediate."
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there was a strategy right away, and surely the relationship between them was played up to get that bestseller sort of vibe off of it.
So Tartt also talks about how during her writing process, she spent, quote, months and years inside libraries. She visits the places that her books are set in. She has her notebook with her at all times. She just writes down little bits of overheard conversation. Apparently she has a filing system of those descriptions and dialogue, so she can just draw on them whenever she needs to. So she says, quote, "Some rainy morning when I need a character, I just go back to central casting and I find one."
So she's a painter, right? She's just always working on a canvas, always, you know, putting new paint on it, seeing what she can see.
So another thing to point out here, though, is that like this book is set primarily in two places: New York, Las Vegas, and Amsterdam. So that means that she was traveling to those places over and over again so that she could write about them and absorb them into the content of this novel. And that subsequently both dictated the story and took a long time. Again, though, like I think this is a reminder, like this is a person who is writing on a very different level in that she has the money to be able to just go to these cities when she wants to stay in a hotel in New York when she wants to sit around and write about things the way that she does. I would love to know what Tartt did in the 10 years between graduating from college and writing The Secret History. I want to know, like how is she like the rest of us?
You'll have to creep at the Soho Grand and wait for her to show up.
I'll just ask the doorman at the Soho Grand.
So here's the way that the Goldfinch kind of coalesced, which I find really interesting because it's not I wanted to write a story about Theo and this is how I built it. The real starting point of the Goldfinch is Amsterdam and a painting, wanting to write about these things and not having a story to go with them. She even said, I've had it in my mind that I wanted to evoke a creepy, spoiled, airless, insular, and damaged Park Avenue mood. That was interesting. What made it come together for me was a trip to Las Vegas that I didn't want to go on. The hotel I was staying in had an art exhibition. I think it was Impressionist, and it made the story take shape. Art, money, Vegas. Somehow it all came together in my mind, the trajectory of the story. And then she says, do things you don't necessarily think you're going to like. I didn't like Las Vegas, but it unlocked my book. So these locations and these attitudes are what finally made the Goldfinch become a writing project, not a need to write a coming-of-age story or a sort of heistish crime novel, but then overwrite it into a literary book or anything like that.
But then she basically says the same thing. She reiterates what she said in a previous interview, which is once the Goldfinch, the book, is safely out in the world and it's established, she's just going to leave it there to fend for herself. And then she just, quote, goes back to her desk.
Yeah. I mean, it's very appealing, especially when you read all the reviews and find out what it would be like if she had to go out and defend herself.
Oh, God, yeah. Well, you can see very much why she wouldn't want to. She also says this about herself, which I thought was somewhat interesting, and I guess is part of the reason why she seems to focus on these coming-of-age stories.
Would you say this has something to do with that Peter Pan thing?
Right, yeah. I believe that it might be referred to as Peter Panism. She says, everyone has a natural age. I am somewhere between 14 and 18, maybe 19. I just never made the segue into domestic life.
Yeah, she credits what is adult about her, in essence, to her reading habits. She says that when she discovered Dickens and fell in love with him, she had been reading Nancy Drew. Very soon, she says, I became uninterested at all in Nancy. In Dickens, there was the risk of real death. There was real blood. I've loved him ever since.
I would also like to note, just to clarify something we mentioned earlier, we referred to her Virginia home as a cottage. Here in this article, it's referred to as an antiques-filled 19th century tobacco plantation. So, and apparently she's fond of Boston Terriers. She has one named Punch.
So it seems like no one's been to the house in the country, that she's kept them out of there, and it's more of a whatever she says about it is what you then write into your article about her.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's also like she has a point where she's talking to one of these people about her supposed reclusivity. They actually compare her to Harper Lee, so I'm glad to see I'm not the only one. But she says, no, I'm not like that. And then she says, look, I hang out with Bret Easton Ellis, and I'm a guest at several of Joan Didion's holiday parties, even though she's described as, quote, undeniably secretive, enigmatic, something almost otherworldly. So, I don't know. I think there's a manufactured narrative that the publishing industry has, that the criticism industry has, and then she is somewhat trying to battle against that. But at the same time, there's something compelling about her that like just kind of draws you in.
You know, I feel like she knows exactly what kind of literary profile is going to be compelling, and she leans into it. That's
possible, yeah.
If she was totally uninterested in talking to the media, she wouldn't do it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And she is gossipy, and she talks about how, she's friends with Bret Easton Ellis, or I've been to Joan Didion's parties. Like, she lets this out.
Yeah.
And she has been photographed a ton.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think in a way,
I feel like listeners, like if you don't know what she looks like, you should just Google image search her right now, and you'll see what we mean by all the photos.
Yeah. And I think that she is someone who examined how the writer exists in the world from early on,
mm-hmm.
and made some decisions, some very specific decisions about how she would be a writer in the world.
I think so too. There's no evidence of this, but it seems to go back to that writing program at Bennington, right?
Yeah.
It seems to have very much crafted the idea of what it means to be a professional literature writer.
Yeah. And a lot of this would not be nearly as interesting if she hadn't had a huge success first time, out.
Mm-hmm.
If her first book had been The Little Friend and then The Secret History, and people were like, oh, yes, her first novel, which didn't make much of a splash, was followed
mm-hmm.
by an extraordinary second novel, it would be a very different thing.
Yeah.
I want to bring all of this to a close before we, talk briefly about the publisher. It's an enormous book.
Yeah.
A ton of stuff happens in it. We could go into a very detailed plot summary, and we're not. We could talk about the language of it, but we're not going to do that either. The point to be taken from this sort of production section is that she is a writer who spends a long time writing, writes long books, uses parts of her life to help along her ideas more than finding these compelling stories that she then tries to bring to life.
Yeah.
And that she is, in many ways, trying to emulate a writing, not style, but a writing existence, a writer's identity that's a bit out of date.
I will just throw in one weird point of comparison that'll probably be useful to come up later, though. This is not Infinite Jest or Gravity's Rainbow. This is not, it is the same size as those books, but it is not as dense as those books are. This is more like The Stand by Stephen King. It's that long of a book, but it's very readable. It's a page turner.
Yeah.
And that is important because Stephen King heralds her later and gives her a lot of praise, and that becomes a reason then subsequently by why literary critics attack her. So if you've not read this or some of those other books, this hopefully gives you a point of comparison.
Yeah. So The Goldfinch was published by Little Brown and Company, which is an American publisher. It was founded in 1837 by Charles Coffin Little and James Brown. They published both fiction and nonfiction. The company was purchased in 1968 by Time, then became part of Time Warner in 1989. You see where this is going, Chris? Mm-hmm. What do you think? Where's it going to land?
They're owned by one of the big five.
Yeah, the editing staff went from Boston to New York City, and the book division of Time Warner was sold to, spin the wheel, Hachette in 2006.
I took these notes from when we covered Infinite Jest, and then I did a double check to make sure there wasn't anything major that had changed at Little Brown since then. It does not seem so. So it's worth noting this is the same publisher that also printed the huge book by David Foster Wallace, so they have a precedent for a thing like this.
And if I look at Donna Tartt's publishing history, yes, it was not for Secret History and The Little Friend.
Okay.
And Little Brown and Company, this is her first book with them.
Okay. So why don't we take a break? When we get back, we're going to dive into the real meat of this episode, which is the awards that this won, but how critically polarizing it actually was. So as we mentioned in the introduction to the show, we are going to be retiring Super Context in May of 2020. We'll continue to keep doing less formal mini episodes as part of our Patreon community, and we'll explain a little bit of that here, tell you a little bit more about the community, and then thank the people who are involved in it.
Yeah, this is the Patreon spot. So for now, our Patreon campaign is maintaining regular operations of the podcast, paying hosting fees, covering expenses for media, and keeping the recording setup up to date. Stuff does break, sadly. When we cease production of regular episodes, the Patreon community will support keeping the public RSS feed active and free so people can still discover the show and dig into the archives.
That's right. So for $1 a month, you will get access to every episode of Super Context, all of the minisodes, and all of the other content like Super King Context, as well as the new minisodes that Charlie and I are going to record. For now, until May of 2020, we're going to keep things as normal. And you can go to patreon.com/supercontext to see all the tiers that we have. I'll just let you know that we offer a number of rewards for people who are patrons of the show. So these include access to outtakes and blooper reels, bi-weekly bonus mini episodes, and the aforementioned monthly shadow podcast, Super King Context, where we talk about adaptations of Stephen King's work. Oh my God, this month we did an episode about the Dark Tower movie, and I swear it broke me. I think my brain was bleeding out of my ears after we did that episode.
It felt like you and I went to a restaurant, and we both ordered the same spice level heat, in our meal, and that you died, and I thought, oh, that's quite tasty. You were really affected by what, for me, ultimately was just kind of a, experience.
Yeah, it knocked me down. I think it was too much. It's too much. Anyways, if you want to hear my brains leak out of my ears, become a patron and you can listen to that in real time.
Something that everyone gets, unless they say don't do it, is a thank you in each and every regular episode of Super Context. And so we're going to do that now. We have new patrons.
Can I say these names?
Yes, and let me say why you want to say them. These obvious pseudonyms are fantastic.
Yeah, so we have 2 new patrons, Bing Bong Man and Romantic Placebo.
Don't you think it's Bing Bongman?
I do, but I really just like the cadence of Bing Bong Man.
So thank you, Bing. Thank you, Romantic. We appreciate you joining the community, even after hearing that we're moving to a different production schedule in May.
Yeah.
Also, thank you to all our other patrons, Alex Laird, Alice Florence, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, Andy Riggs, B.B. Schwells, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Billy Whitehouse, Brian Chovanich, Caroline Zoids, Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, and Coco.
Thank you also to Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, Eilish Phillips, Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, Gregory C. Giordano, Ira James Udiskin, Jason Puckett, Jess Staten, Joseph Aleo, Juan Patton, Junta/Cult, Calvin Ellis, Carmela Padovich, and Kate Sharon.
Thank you to Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirvala, Lee Fowler, Liliana Gill, Lokesh Dakar, Luigi Oswego, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bowe, and Philip.
Thank you also to R.M. Rhodes, The Podcast, Rain It In, Matt and Rachel, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, Roman Marichek, Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Simon Workman, Tara Mishak, Thomas Tremberger, Vielheit, and Whitney Buchanan.
Man, you just wrote it all the way to the end, didn't you?
I did. I ride it hard and I put it away wet.
I'm going to pretend you didn't say that. Thank you, everyone, for being a Patreon supporter. Super Context could not happen without you. And we're back. I feel like we've had a lot of sparse awards sections in our episodes recently. Mm-hmm. You know, the things that we've talked about haven't won a lot of awards. And the reason I think that is because this book won 6 distinct awards that kind of cover the waterfront. It is the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Amazon selected it as the 2013 Best Book of the Year. It was on the National Book Critics Circle Awards shortlist in 2013. It won the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction. It won the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. And it was one of the 10 best of 2013 as identified by the New York Times Book Review.
So you'd see that maybe and you'd think like, oh, this is a beloved book. But it is a real cantankerous battlefield out there when you get into the reviews.
Well, what's interesting, Chris, is that those awards imply that it's a very important book. Mm-hmm. And the real fight comes down to, is it important or not?
Yeah. And I think a lot of these arguments, I'll just say right up front, are less about the book than they are about what literary criticism means or should mean. This was just the case study that was pulled out in 2014 to argue about this with.
I want to throw this up at the top. I've been reading the Beale books about publishing coming out of Microcosm Publishers in Portland. He calls all of this the literary industrial complex. Mm-hmm. And when I first read that in one of his books, I thought it was a little twee. I thought it was maybe kind of leaning too hard into that metaphor. Mm-hmm. And now, especially after reading all of this for the Goldfinch, I'm sold. Yes, there is a literary industrial complex.
Well, and, you know, I don't want to go back to that episode too much because some people said I was a little mean in that episode, but I said something similar in the episode about Jennifer Egan's Welcome to the Goon Squad.
A Visit from the Goon Squad. You can't even remember the title. You just chunked it out of your head.
Tried to shove it out of my head, yeah. There's a piece written about this whole argument by Evgenia Peretz at Variety, and it's pretty well done. I will say this is going to be a little different than our normal reviews section because we don't normally read reviews. We kind of give an overview and then move on. But these are so pointed that I feel like it's necessary for us to read some of these quotes. Peretz writes about the Goldfinch and said, when it came out, recipients of the advanced copies were showing it off as Instagram photos, like taking selfies with it. They were excited that they had received it and would read it before somebody else.
Look who got a copy of the new Donna Tartt book.
Yeah. She compared it to the announcement of the birth of a child. And all of Tartt's readings of it sold out instantly. Then they get into where the contention began. First was with Michiko Kakutani, who was the chief reviewer of books for the New York Times. And they said, The Goldfinch is a glorious Dickensian novel, a novel that pulls together all of Tartt's remarkable storytelling talents into a rapturous symphonic whole. It's a work that shows us how many emotional octaves Miss Tartt can now reach, how seamlessly she can combine the immediate and tactile with more wide-angled concerns.
Now, Kakutani is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize herself for a book of criticism, or for criticism. So it's interesting. Like they're on the same team.
Mm-hmm. Now, it wouldn't be a super context episode if we didn't somehow mention Stephen King. I've already mentioned him once.
Well, this is such a ringer, too. Like talking about a big, fat, best-selling book that some people say is not literary at all. Of course.
Right.
I mean, you've got to at least be thinking of him.
So Stephen King reviewed it for New York Times Book Review, and he says that The Goldfinch is a rarity that comes along perhaps half a dozen times per decade. It is a smartly written literary novel that connects with the heart as well as the mind.
Chris, this is a perfect time to refer to that article that we found just this morning.
Yeah, so I got up this morning before we recorded this, and my RSS feed recommended an article to me that was published today as we're recording this in the New Republic. It is called How Not to Write a Book Review. And it's by Alex Shepard, and it is all about how, as we're recording this in 2020, novelist Lauren Groff reviewed a book called American Dirt by an author named Janine Cumins. Okay?
And I need to say, this is a book that's already on my list of things to read because I had a conversation with a writer about stuff that I wanted to work on, and she said, "Oh, you really need to check out this American Dirt book when it comes out."
Oh, okay. I know nothing about American Dirt. I know a little tiny bit about Lauren Groff because she was a guest on the show that I used to work on. Basically, the argument boils down to that Lauren Groff wrote this review, and in the review, Lauren Groff said, "I'm a white lady. I don't know that I'm the person who should be qualified to write a review about this book about a mother and son fleeing cartel violence in Mexico." And that then subsequently people turned around and said, "Yeah, you shouldn't have reviewed it."
And what this really highlights for us, and needs to kind of land in this moment in the Goldfinch episode, is that she was a novelist asked to write a review.
Mm-hmm.
And this appears to be the way now that reviewing entities, corporate reviewing entities, sell a book.
Right.
And validate it.
It's more interesting if an author sort of tangentially like the author being reviewed reviews the book than a critic. And one of the things that was pointed out in this New Republic article that I was unaware of is that apparently this is a standard practice for the New York Times Book Review. Hence, Stephen King reviewing Donna Tartt in 2013. The New Republic article says it's a long-standing problem that the review has, and that it's become an industry tip sheet rather than an actual venue for serious criticism, and that the majority of its fiction reviewers are actually novelists, not critics. They tend to review books with professional restraint because they have sympathy that comes from toiling in the same industry and partly out of the knowledge that this situation could someday be reversed. So basically, they're trying not to burn bridges professionally in the industry that they work in. And so the review, New York Times Book Review, is seen as a, quote, safe, staid publication, one that is firmly embedded in the publishing establishment, or, as Joe Beal would call it, the literary publishing industrial complex.
And another writer calls the literary critical establishment when they cite Stephen King's non-existent need to not burn bridges. Stephen King don't give a fuck, right? Because in 2003, he was given a medal by the National Book Foundation for his, quote, distinguished contribution to American letters.
I believe we've talked about this quote before, actually.
And this writer points out, in King's acceptance speech, he said, "What do you think?" to the, quote, fancy pants, "You get social academic brownie points for deliberately staying out of touch with your own culture," and asked why they made it a point of pride never to have read anything by best-selling authors like John Grisham, Tom Clancy, and Mary Higgins Clark, which made Harold Bloom lose his shit, and then also gave King an opportunity to say that he didn't like James Patterson. So it just spiraled out of control so quickly.
But apparently all of this is to point out, look, Stephen King has a history of this civil war between literary establishment and popular writers of fiction.
Yeah. James Patterson, he gets to say in response to Stephen King shitting on him, Stephen King said, "I don't respect his books because everyone is the same." James Patterson said, "Doesn't make too much sense. I'm a good dad, a nice husband. My only crime is I've sold millions of books." Which is such an interesting, this just ends the idea of culture as the battlefield for these things.
Yeah.
It's more just like, why are you getting on my case? I just sold a bunch of books. It doesn't matter.
Well, that is an argument that Stephen King himself has made as well, that the only reason why people are critical of his work is because he's sold a lot of books. So he might just be throwing his own words back at him.
Patterson using judo.
Okay, so back to the Goldfinch after that detour. James Wood wrote about it, not the James Woods. James Wood wrote about it.
Not the actor, but an actual critic.
For the New Yorker. And he says that the Goldfinch's tone, language, and story belong in children's literature. He thought the book was stuffed with relentless, far-fetched plotting, we've already mentioned that, cloying stock characters, Tartt's mentioned that, and an overwrought message tacked on at the end as a plea for seriousness. In fact, quote, Tartt's consoling message blared in the book's final pages is that what will survive of us is great art, but this seems an anxious compensation, as if Tartt were unconsciously acknowledging that the Goldfinch might not survive the way that the actual painting the Goldfinch has. Days after this, she was awarded the Pulitzer, after this guy said this about her. And Wood was asked, "What do you think about that?" And he said, "I think that the rapture with which this novel has been received is further proof of the infantilization of our literary culture. It's a world in which adults go around reading Harry Potter."
And it doesn't end there. In the New York Review of Books, Francine Prose, have you read her at all?
No.
I read her book, The Blue Angel, Blue Angel, which is about a professor who finds himself completely destroyed by a complicated plot by one of his students.
Okay, far out.
And she argues that despite all the Dickensian labeling, that Tartt demonstrates little of Dickens' remarkable powers of description and graceful language. She says some passages are bombastic, overwritten, and marred by baffling turns of phrase. Reading The Goldfinch, Prose says, I found myself wondering, doesn't anyone care how something is written anymore?
Yeah.
The London Review of Books called it a children's book for adults. The London Sunday Times said no amount of straining for high-flown uplift can disguise the fact that The Goldfinch is a turkey.
Wow. So we're starting to see blood has been drawn.
Yeah.
It's also written about by the Paris Review. Lauren Stein wrote about it there and said, a book like The Goldfinch doesn't undo any cliches. It deals in them. It coats everything in a cozy patina of, quote, literary gentility. Who cares that Kakutani or Stephen King gave it the stamp of approval? Nowadays, even the New York Times Book Review is afraid to say when a popular book is crap.
Now, we can't let Lauren Stein go by without mentioning that he did step down from the Paris Review in 2017. There were accusations of sexual impropriety.
Oh, well, thank you for bringing that up. I had no idea. It wouldn't be a super context episode if somebody,
unfortunately, wasn't
a scumbag.
And this in no way is me saying so you can't trust him. we can't say this is what the Paris Review said and then not mention that Lawrence Stein stepped down.
We've got a couple more of these to go through, but before we do, Charlie, let's pause and you and I take stock for a second here. Not based on what you just said, but how do you feel about what we're seeing play out here? Like, and in terms of your own critical take on the Goldfinch.
So whenever someone says that something I like is middlebrow, I get really antsy. I feel dangerously close to some kind of existential crisis.
Because it's important to you that
I don't want it to be true. I mean, maybe saying it like that makes it sound untrue.
Okay.
But I don't want to be caught in a miasma of consumer-based art.
Okay, yeah.
When people say, this is a children's book, I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
Whatever. Some of my most favorite books in the world are children's books. And the more that someone argues that something is only popular because it appeals to people, the less interesting I find the argument.
Yeah. So I think this argument is positioned as an either or kind of thing. But I think there's something more complex going on here, at least from my point of view. Remember, I've accused other books of the same thing that these folks are accusing this book of. It is a bone to pick I have, right? I am annoyed in the same way some of these folks are by the machinations of the sort of, quote, literary genre in terms of how it's marketed and published. At the same time, I've read more than half of Tartt's novel, and while it was frustrating and annoying in parts, I do recognize that it is like a piece of work that somebody spent a lot of time and energy and thought on, and that while it has problems, it's also a really interesting piece of work that deserves attention.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would say it's, quote, good, right? Like, I'm not going to use qualifiers, subjective qualifiers like that, but it's interesting. And those other books that I've complained about in the past, for me, they weren't interesting, right? They were sort of pretending to be literary.
And pretending by being hard to listen, hard to read.
Well, yeah, yes and no, but I would say too that, like, outside of whether or not the Goldfinch is, quote, literary or not, what we're seeing here is people within this industry fighting over what their identity means, what it means to be a critic, what it means to be a reader, what it means to be highbrow, right?
And what it means when you support one kind of book over the other.
Yeah. Yeah,
This is a perfect time to bring in Wood again. There seems to be universal agreement that the book is a good read, but you can be a good storyteller, which in some ways Tartt clearly is, and still not be a serious storyteller. Here we go. Where, of course, serious does not mean the exclusion of the comic or the joyful or the exciting. Tartt's novel is not a serious one. It tells a fantastical, even ridiculous tale based on absurd and improbable premises.
That seems to me to be... I'm trying to think of like a language in which to talk about this stuff with, and I'm going to turn to somebody that is contentious for you and I on this show, Jeff Vandermeer. I've been looking at Wonder Book by him again, and looking at how he tries to establish a language for talking about narrative and the tools and parts of narrative so that we can talk about it sort of equally. Wood's argument there seems to be entirely focused on plot and not focused on any of the other important mechanisms that make a book work, whether it's character or theme or point of view or style. All of those things are ignored. His review is mainly, well, I didn't believe that the things that happened in this book could have happened, so therefore everything is bad in this.
Yeah. Do you remember how Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses begins?
Oh, barely. It's been a while since I've read that book. It's an angel falling out of the sky?
Yeah, there's a plane falls apart, and these two characters are falling through the sky.
Mm-hmm.
It is a cartoonish moment. It's written that one of the characters has a bowler hat that's still stuck on their head as they fall straight down. I think arms crossed, and the other one is a large person who is sort of twisting around. I mean, anyway, the Satanic Verses, which was understood as a very important book and had a lot of attention paid to it for reasons that weren't just the writing.
Yeah.
No one ever said, oh, it's a fantastical, ridiculous tale based on absurd and improbable premises, which it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just one example that I can come up with.
So Peretz is really like what they're trying to do with this article is give you points of comparison of all of the arguments on this, and then use this as a case study to say, like, there's something fundamentally broken about the way we talk about books and like whether they're good or not, or the function of criticism. And they turn to Jonathan Galassi, who is the president of Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, another big publisher. Determining what is serious literature isn't a science. This is Galassi talking. He says he hasn't even read the Goldfinch. But he says the response to it isn't actually rationalized, because ultimately the book itself must be convincing in some way. It can't just be emotionally convincing. It has to also be intellectually convincing, or it could be politically convincing. And he says, hopefully, it's all of those things. But with somebody like Donna Tartt, not everybody gets convinced on all of those levels.
So let's restate that. He said, you can't really explain why something is serious literature. It just is. You feel it, and you might feel it through emotions or your intellect or even through your political values.
Mm-hmm.
The best books, it's all of them. But not everybody feels convinced by this book, so it's not serious literature.
Yeah, yeah. Another person Peretz turned to for an opinion on this was Lev Grossman, who is known for the popular, I guess it's like urban fantasy books, The Magicians, which is now a TV show. Grossman said Wood, the person criticizing and saying this is a little kid's book, is somebody that he admires, but they doesn't have the critical language that is actually needed to praise a book like The Goldfinch. He says the kinds of things that the book does particularly well don't lend themselves to literary analysis. Donna Tartt's language is careless in places. There's a fairy tale quality to the book. There's very little context in the book. It's happening in some slightly simplified world. Lev Grossman says that's fine for me. I find that to be compelling. Every novel dispenses with something, and this is what Tartt dispenses with.
Yeah, I'm totally convinced by that.
Yeah.
I never would have felt like I needed to argue with anybody. Oh, The Goldfinch is literature.
Right.
But as soon as the argument's been thrown at me, I find that the people who are on the side of it's not serious literature appear to be saying this is not her place. She's not allowed in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or even I think the larger problem is one of purpose and language, right? Is that I think that there is an argument over what criticism means and how we define or quantifiably measure quality in literature. And there's no one formula for that. And they're using Tartt as a case study to argue about that. I'm sure since the Tartt was published, there's been plenty of other books that they've used to argue about that.
Well, here's Prose talking about Francine Prose talking about why she felt like she had to go after the Goldfinch, right? And this is quoted and summarized by Peretz. Everyone was saying this is such a great book and the language was so amazing, I felt I had to make a case against it because she says holding up weak books, like not well done books, as examples of excellence promotes mediocrity and turns young readers off forever. That is what she feared would happen if the Goldfinch were given unconditional praise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Stein sort of backs that up and says, I worry that people who read only 1 or 2 books a year are going to plunk down their money for the Goldfinch. They're going to read it, and then they're going to tell themselves that they like it. But deep down, they're going to be profoundly bored because they are not children, and they will quietly give up on the entire enterprise when in fact fiction, realistic fiction or old or new, is as alive and gripping as it's ever been.
So that's the ex-editor of the Paris Review saying, I'm worried that people will enjoy this book and like it despite the fact that it's boring, and it will keep them from being good citizens of the literature of society.
Yeah, basically they're saying that like the barometer that we're using to measure quality is poorly calculated, and therefore like we're telling people this is good literature, go read this and you will be enlightened, but in fact it is not.
I'm totally in the place now where I feel like the folks arguing against the Goldfinch are saying, who are you going to believe? Me or your lying eyes? Now I know it's not as easily dispensed with as that, but it does seem like they're actively trying to say, you think you like this, you think it's good, but it's not.
Which, look, Charlie, I have to cop to. That's what I basically said about that Egan book.
It might be, but like this is more than that, because the subtext and sometimes, text of all of this is that this is bad for people to read because it will make them stupid.
Yeah.
They will not be able to...
That's different than what I was arguing.
Yeah, they will not be able to enjoy real literature, which we are producing or editing or publishing. If they keep reading this stuff, it's like they're reading Harry Potter all over again. And that argument is very different from your sort of, I don't like that I was sold this bestseller as a really vibrant statement about life when what it was kind of a coy, ironic dud for me.
Yeah. I think you have that a lot closer. I would say something, too, that is ignored in these arguments. They're arguing over the merits of what I've referred to in the past as the literary genre, right? Like,
yeah.
I think of it as a genre that is both marketed and sold. They completely, all of these people completely ignore genre fiction that is well written solely on the face of it, right? Like I'm thinking again of this. I've talked to you about this book ad nauseum on our mini episodes, but The Vor by Brian Catling is this amazing piece of work that I've been reading concurrently with The Goldfinch, and I don't think any of these people have mentioned The Vor. There's no arguments over The Vor because it doesn't fall into their universe of great literature, even though it's everything they're saying that Donna Tartt's book isn't.
Let's talk about gatekeepers real quick, shall we? Douglas Perry writes in The Oregonian, there used to be a time when a handful of critics decided what was good. Now the great unwashed do so. Mainstream publishers these days send off advance copies not just to established professional critics, but to amateur book bloggers and Goodreads members. The market is deciding more than it ever has before. Those in the crumbling citadels worry about their influence and about the ever-accelerating dumbing down of our tastes, the chipping away at our standards.
Yeah.
Now, whether Perry agrees with that or not, that is a clear summation of the argument and the fear that was floating around in those reviews.
Yeah.
And then he says straight up, the chief complaint about The Goldfinch is that it represents itself as serious fiction, but really it merely mimics serious fiction. And here's where I have to really unpack this. The book does not represent itself as anything.
No.
And Donna Tartt does not represent her book as anything. She stays out of it, right?
Maybe her publisher does. Maybe the marketing people who work
exactly.
for them do. Yeah.
That's my point.
Mm-hmm.
This is about market forces with names on them fighting in the media about whether or not this publisher got the right book or not.
Yeah. When Perry breaks it down, he seems to be saying that the reason why it's not seen as capturing the zeitgeist is because, again, it comes down to plot. He says it's just about story. It's almost entirely about story, which is basically like saying, like, oh, this book doesn't have any themes or characterization or, style. It's only about what happens in it. And Perry brings up William Goldman and something that he said once in a book that he wrote about writing screenplays. William Goldman said, "There is no time in a screenplay where we can lose the audience because movies keep going, 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 and it's not like a novel where you can go back and reread a section or a paragraph."
And so Perry says that's how the Goldfinch is written, as if no one would ever go back and reread it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one that I feel the most like, what about?
Yeah.
Because
there was a lot of stuff in this book that I read and I was like, this is minimalist and simply done, but it's quite elegant.
Yeah. And it's so long that when you lose your place, you will go back and say, I'll start again at this spot, because it is very, Perry says, admit it, you didn't sip your tea, recross your legs, and luxuriate over the prose. And I'm a little bit like, I did exactly that, except I drink coffee.
In Tartt's defense, I will say that even though this is a page turner and it is very much about going, 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 there were a lot of moments in which I stepped back and I was like, wow, that's very insightful. Like, hidden in between all of these pages and pages of descriptions of antiques, there's like some interesting insights about the human condition, which I think is what all of these folks are arguing great literature should have. Yeah. Now,
and they're saying that she's faking it.
Sure. I would say a flaw about this book is that it spends way too much time listing and describing things. It's almost like a George R. R. Martin novel in like how it's just like every single thing gets pages of description, that are nice, and they build an atmosphere in some points, but in other points, I mean, we both talked about skimming. It's just like, all right, I get it. Let's move on. What's the insight here,
All that said, it was on the New York Times bestseller list and the Sunday Times hardcover fiction list in the United Kingdom for 30 weeks. And it sold at least 1.5 million copies.
That is a lot. That is a lot of copies.
That is
especially for a book like
a
this.
lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that is... I know we throw around numbers on here pretty casually sometimes, but that's like stratospheric for a book like this.
And then all of this discussion about story, it was made into a movie pretty recently.
So I have to cop to
died.
something. When you first brought this up, I was like, I have no idea what this is. I've never heard of the book. I am clearly not attuned to what people in the New Yorker and the Paris Review are fighting about.
And aren't you glad? I mean, you personally, aren't you glad?
Oh, yeah. Everything about doing the research for this episode is a confirmation for me that I'm glad that I stayed in my lane. But I will argue, like, the trailer for the Goldfinch is something I saw, like, a year ago. And I remember seeing it and going, huh, I wonder who that's for. And then never thinking about it again. And then I read this entire book and didn't connect the two until I sat down to do the research and watch the trailer again.
Let me take Constance Grady's Vox review of The Goldfinch, which turned into also a review of the book. I'm just going to try and sum this up. The Goldfinch movie didn't make any money. It was a pretty bad opening weekend, and then it just never caught fire. Mm-hmm. It was a $45 million movie. So it was not one of those $2 million movies or $20 million movies. Yeah. It did not get a good rating on Rotten Tomatoes. A lot of people say it just doesn't work. And Grady then suggests that that's because the book doesn't work. That this failure of the movie is essentially a validation of all the arguments that there isn't anything to the book except the readability, the page turner aspect.
I haven't seen the movie. Have you?
No, and I'm not going to argue for this or against this.
I guess my point. Sorry to interrupt here, but my point is that, like, what else would you think would happen when you try to put an 800-page book into a 2-hour movie?
Well, here's the thing. A lot of people are saying, look, this is all about story. It's just story, story, story. There's nothing else to the book. And then when they made a movie out of it, it didn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then this reviewer Grady says, oh, the book was really fun to read, but then it didn't work as a movie. And I think really that just shows it didn't work as a story.
Yeah. Grady goes on to say that the book itself is hollow. It's thematically empty. It has psychologically empty characters. It suffocates under its own weight. This is a direct quote. This is actually a pretty good quote in terms of if you want to, insult the book. Quote, for much of its lengthy sprawl, the Goldfinch has an immersive, read it under the covers with a flashlight vitality. It has the kind of storytelling that you can get lost in, just like you can get lost in the immense and palpable aesthetic pleasure the book takes in objects. This is what I was talking about, listing things.
Yeah.
In signifiers of tony, expensive taste that are paired with virtuous middle-class budgets. When I tried rereading the book recently, it never felt like a chore to pull out the big, heavy hardcover and slip beneath the stream of the plot.
So let me interrupt you right there before you get into the rest of this. All of that sounds like a compliment, doesn't it?
It
sounds
does,
like this
but it's an
successful
insult.
book, right?
Yeah.
It just made me want to read it. But then Grady says, and I'll let you finish,
I started to crave it like coffee. Then I had shut the book, and instead of a pleasurable caffeine buzz, I would only feel let down and disappointed, and a little bit as though the book had manipulated me by trying to get me to buy into cheap sentiment. This is the exact argument that I made about Jennifer Egan's book.
It is.
Grady goes on and says, I couldn't hold on to anything from the long, indulgent reading sprees except for a trite epigram about how good things can come from bad actions. And then there's a long description of someone's extremely boring drug trip. I do like this part, Charlie. The parenthetical is anything in the world more boring than reading about somebody else's drug habits? I'm right there with Grady.
Grady sums it up by saying, Pulitzer Prize or no, The Goldfinch is a fundamentally and massively flawed book. And the movie fails because it exacerbates the flaws that were already there in the source material. So, Chris, that's the flaws that the gatekeepers have declared about the book in an attempt to say it's not serious literature.
Mm-hmm.
Let's flip this and talk about how some people perceived Donna Tartt to act in a way as a gatekeeper.
Yeah. And I think this is probably like a more official point for us to bring up the thing that I kind of casually mentioned earlier, which I don't see a lot of people talk out loud in these pieces about that Tartt is kind of a fashion icon.
You mean they don't explicitly declare it? They just sort of they reference it like, oh, she's quite attractive, put together. Mm-hmm. Everything seems to work in her outfit. But then you found a quote from Laura Blaze McDowell.
Yeah. So I just want to say before I read that quote, I'm not mentioning this because I'm criticizing it. I'm mentioning it because it's another thing that sets her apart from most authors. And I wonder how much of that is subconsciously eating away at these critics and leading to them having an opinion about her. But anyways, Laura Blaze McDowell wrote the following. She says, Donna Tartt has impeccable personal style for which she is famous. During her rare public appearances, Tartt usually wears tailored suits, colored cravats, and has her hair cut in a sharp, distinctive bob. She always pays close attention to what her characters are wearing and has meticulously described their clothing.
Okay. Now that leads us into something that Joy Castro wrote at Salon, which is, I'm just going to read the opening of this quote and then we can talk about it. It's a belief commonly held by the well-to-do that their domestic workers live and love to serve. Call it the Downton Abbey fantasy. The lower classes may indeed have their own little lives and dramas, but their true emotional investment lies in Lady Mary's happiness. Tartt's rosy yet flat depictions of working-class servants of color seem to partake of this fantasy.
Yeah. Castro goes on to give multiple examples. She talks about the way in which the book portrays the Puerto Rican doormen who interact with Theo after his mother dies. She talks about how the housekeeper for the rich family is portrayed. I think there's another point where she mentions, the people of color in the Las Vegas community that he ends up living in. And Castro goes on to say, in this book, Donna Tartt's working class people of color read like wishful caricatures. But in contrast, all the characters of importance in the novel, the ones who have meaty speaking roles or any complexity, are white.
Castro very gently accuses Tartt of seeing white people in a complex way and seeing not white people as functional.
This is sort of what I was feeling, not necessarily along ethnic lines, but more along class lines when I first read, I don't know, the first 200 pages of this book. Was just like, okay, like, you are clearly a person of privilege who is writing about people of privilege, but you're like, the worldview isn't taking it into account people who are not privileged.
Yeah.
And it really nagged at me for a while in that book, until there was a point I got to with the Goldfinch where I realized, it is intentionally class commentary, but its class divisions are only in the upper class striations, right?
Yeah. And there's also the idea that Theo is if not unreliable narrator, then he is coloring the narration with his own character.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, this is where I feel like, okay, Donna Tartt is right. To have that argument, we can discuss that, and Castro can talk about it, and it's useful. It's it's a useful argument in the world.
This is something that helps us think differently about other people's perspectives and approach it in whatever the next piece of art is that contributes to the history of the human condition.
But as soon as Tartt comes out and says something like, well, I meant that, it's an explosion.
Yeah.
It becomes now an argument with her.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you Castro's argument and some very good pieces of evidence. Castro says, when characters of color do appear in the Goldfinch, they function not in the fullness of their humanity, but merely to revolve around the well-off white characters they serve. It's an odd omission in a book that is, in other ways, so careful. Layered, amusing, and often artfully crafted at the sentence level, the Goldfinch explicitly favors the old over the new, the real over the fake, the lost or carefully preserved work of art over the easily accessible commodity.
Yeah, I guess, like, so plot-wise, to sort of ground that a little bit, she's talking about how, I think she means that it's Eurocentric, that, like, both the lineages of the people who are really into art, whether it's paintings or antiques, are Caucasian, and that the people who are creating these works of art are Caucasian.
Yeah, and in a way, if you revere the time of the old masters, you're also revering a time of white supremacy.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Castro goes on to say, for many people, especially the sort who commit to reading hefty novels, it's a sensibility that is easy to like. This is an elegiac novel. It has a series of lost mothers at its core, and it laments the passing of the old ways at its heart, the old masters, the old country, the faithful craft of artisans. The Goldfinch has a neat set of binaries. New York versus Las Vegas. New York is beautiful old architecture and museums. Las Vegas is gaudy imitation icons, junk food, and miles of tract housing.
Then Castro goes for the jugular and says, in the scene where Theo discovers that what he thought was the Goldfinch painting is actually a weighted package with not even a fake, but just something else inside.
Mm-hmm.
He opens the package and discovers that inside it is, quote, a scribbled up civics workbook, democracy, diversity, and you. Bright multicultural throng. On the cover, Asian kids, Latino kids, African American kids, Native American kids, a girl in a Muslim headscarf, and a white kid in a wheelchair smiled and held hands before an American flag. Inside the book's cheery, dull world of good citizenship, where persons of different ethnicities all participated happily in their communities, and inner city kids stood around their housing project with a watering can, caring for a potted tree. So this is Donna Tartt writing Theo, discovering that the thing that he loved,
the MacGuffin of the book,
has been replaced by, and let me go back to Castro here. In the ideological structure of her novel, Whatever lay inside that wrapping represented the cheap, fake substitute for what was good and true and real, the beloved, the dear, the irreplaceable. Whatever lay inside was the linchpin of Tartt's symbol system, the precise negative of the delicate, precious old master painting enshrined on the cover, in the title, and within the novel's plot. And Castro goes on to say that Tartt could have written anything into that package to be the fakery. And what she seems to have written is a paean to multiculturalism, and saying thus that, if you remove the painting by the old master, what replaces it is this, overdone multicultural fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
But let us remember, and this is me talking, not Castro, let us remember that we don't have Tartt to explain to us whether that was the point of Theo, the point of the book, the thing that Theo would then get over, etc. This is like one small piece of an 830-page book. And Tartt will not defend her choices.
Yeah. And so if I remember correctly, in the book, there's probably, in Tartt's mind, a characterization reason why that was what was in the package. Because the character of Boris, who is the one who replaces the package, over and over again, it is talked about how bad he is in his American civics class because he's Russian. He doesn't understand the importance of all the minutiae of rules and government regulations that he has to memorize and study. And this is the book from that class that he's using. He's basically saying, here's the thing that's the least important to me right now.
Yeah, and the description for Theo is the kind of dismissing of the superficial qualities of that book.
Yeah.
Now, all that to say, it's less important that we now figure out, was Tartt a secret, white supremacist? Right. Does she have gentle, resistance to multiculturalism or whatever? It's this. This is what Castro says. Whatever the significance of Tartt's choices, they haven't yet been thrashed out on a cultural level because the book's many supporters and critics haven't been interested in discussing this aspect. What does it say about contemporary U.S. culture and letters that the Goldfinch has earned wild marketplace success, won critical acclaim, and stirred significant discussion, and we should read that as, and been attacked, while its race and class politics have gone unremarked?
So I'll just say, for comparison, when I was doing the research, the first, 5 pages, 20-odd articles of results that I went through, she's right. They didn't say anything about this. I had to specifically go digging and looking for something that specifically addressed how diversity and representation was handled in this book. And even then, it wasn't at the top. I think this is a really good point that there's so much navel gazing between the literati about what's important about their careers and how they judge literature that they're sort of, missing the forest for the trees.
If we go back to that Vox piece by Grady, they lay out that as Dickensian as people describe the book, it's really not, except for an obsession, and this is a quote, an obsession with morality as signified by taste and social class.
Yeah.
And it's almost like that reflects the argument that's being had in the literary circles. It's not about multiculturalism. It's not about the colors of people's skins. This is all about what's good and bad. What should a colorblind person revere? Good taste.
Yeah.
The way you act in your class, or better or worse than your class.
Grady points out the book sets up a division between good characters and bad characters, right? And then there's some questionable characters in between. And the good characters always are educated and they have strong cosmopolitan tastes in things. The bad characters have bad aesthetic tastes in things, and they are immoral in how they acquire their wealth, right?
Yeah, or bad characters have good taste but have way too much money to indulge.
So, for instance, Theo's mother is a good character. The character of Hobie, is that how you would say his name, Hobie?
I would say Hobby, but hey, whatever.
Again, is compared to Jesus in this book, and he runs an antique shop and spends all day in the basement fixing old antique furniture. The bad characters are Theo's dad, who is a gambler who lives in Las Vegas, and Mr. Barber, who I don't remember what his job is. Is he an investment banker?
I mean, is that even important?
Something like that, but is also mentally ill.
Upper East Side dad.
Yeah, all he talks about is sailing all the time.
There seems to be a lot of careful delineation of how people respond to high, low, and middle-brow culture.
Mm-hmm.
And as Grady says, I find this moral system very pleasurable to read. It ignites a warm glow of intellectual snobbery in me. Grady gets into the idea that, oh yeah, Mr. Barber is a fool, doesn't even know that you can only like Maxfield Parrish self-consciously, kitschy, ironically. How embarrassing is that? I am so much better than he is. And that snobbery, I think, is one of the major pleasures of the Goldfinch. Now here's the crazy thing. Grady then goes on to say, after I close the book, I realize that I have a Maxfield Parrish print that I really like.
Yeah, like it's fun to indulge in the feelings of class snobbery within the book. But then you go back into the real world and you realize, like, oh, wait a minute. Like, I participate in this ironic absurdity as well.
And let me ask you something, Chris.
Yeah.
What could be more serious in literature than to reflect your own flaws back to you and force you to think about them in the world after you've read the book?
That is a good point. Grady says this, though. The snobbery of the book amplifies another thing that the Goldfinch does very well, but something that strikes Grady as more valuable than moralizing the tastes of the cosmopolitan elite. Namely, it glories in the aesthetic pleasures of objects.
Right. So this is now, even if there is a moral sense to, hey, disparaging snobbery, look at your own self, it does seem to then, as a book, and Tartt as a writer, seems to get into what you were talking about, long lists of things and just enjoyment of objects that signify high taste and high class.
Yeah, and so Grady points out, for all of the attention that Tartt gives to these long lists of nouns, of things, that doesn't justify that the Goldfinch's central theme is that life is terrible, death always wins, and deathless art offers us one of our only meaningful reprieves from mass entropy.
Can I just say, I don't recognize the book that Grady is talking about right there.
I do. I do recognize it. And I sympathize with Grady more than you do. But but it's harsh. Everybody has a harsh opinion about this book. Grady finishes off by saying, we're left with this book that has a central joy that's intrinsically tied to the medium of the book itself. All it is a list of nouns with very little else behind them. This is no longer the thing that the story itself is about. It just becomes the thing that the story is happening around.
It's funny. That particular argument is the one that I feel like I have to jump up and defend Tartt from. And so I think what that just means is there's something about saying, oh, the book is just good as a book. It's not good as something else.
Oh.
And that kind of makes my hackles rise.
Well, remember Grady's whole piece, for context,
is
about the movie.
About the movie.
Yeah.
And I want to finish what I just said about my hackles by saying, and I need to just back off from that. Because again, this is indicative of a response.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would ask you two things. The first is, why do you think that one triggered you when all the other insults that were hurled at it didn't trigger you? But then also, do you think that Grady writing for Vox instead of, say, Vogue or Vanity Fair is potentially writing this as clickbait to purposely anger somebody so that they will comment on it on social media and engage with the product.
Now, I think the thing about the medium is thrown away too much for that to be the clickbaity stuff.
Okay.
I think it's... I'm only going to do this once, Chris, and then we're going to move on. I think I get a little bit irritated when people seem to suggest that the words are the thing that's nice about this book, not the book itself, when that's part of what people do with books.
The ways, so it's the way in which she's stringing together words. It is the pleasure of the reading.
Yeah, the actual pleasure of the reading is there. And then when she says it's all about the lists of nouns with very little else behind them, it's almost like, well, no, if they bring you pleasure, there's something else there.
I think
a list of nouns is not going to make you happy,
mm-hmm.
even if they're the best nouns, even if they're the best words, Chris, even if the nouns are the best nouns.
Oh, God, don't ever do that again. I think there's value to both things, right? And I think that the argument that Grady and maybe a lot of other people here are trying to make is that, like, again, none of them are using the same language, but like,
yeah, that's true.
But like, a good book should have good style and good plot and well thought out themes, not one or the other. It should be all of those things.
Yeah, but I like the Ramones, and I like Yes, and I like Beethoven.
Right. Yeah, I don't disagree. And I think that there's value in all of those things. All right, let's move on to a couple other things from the big theme before we wrap up here. So we talked about how the painting or whatever was in the package is a symbol, seems to speak to how important art is or what the theme of the book is. Grady seems to think that theme is that, like, the world sucks. The only thing of value in the world are the quality objects that we leave behind.
Yeah, that continue after you are dead.
Now another Grady, but this time an O'Grady, Megan O'Grady, who writes in Vogue magazine about this, says the book is this: art's secret history is its capacity to speak to us powerfully across time, the serendipity and faith involved in creating it. And there are themes like this that excite Tartt, who was in the Netherlands when she first promoted her first novel, and that's where she saw the painting that inspired her to write all of this.
And the idea that painting, the real painting of the Goldfinch, is a painting that survived an explosion.
Yeah.
Most of Fabritius's work was destroyed in, quote, the massive Delft gunpowder arsenal explosion that killed him.
Right. This is one of the things that I think critics harp on as being unrealistic, that the artist himself was killed in an explosion, and subsequently the character in this saves the painting from another explosion, that it's too coincidental.
Yeah, and then it feels a little bit like this is a half-assing of 9/11.
Uh-huh.
You know, an attempt to become discussion of bombs and discussion of lives exploded without actually attaching it to something outside of Theo's experience.
Yeah, I watched an interview with her, and she said actually the first inspiration for the bombing was the 2001 bombing of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. And then she said 9/11 happened, and she was like, okay, like, this is the world telling me I have to put some kind of a terrorist attack into this book.
Yeah, she says when something haunts you, that's when you know you're on to something. Let us give Evgenia Peretz from Variety the last word here, because this quote is exactly what we've been talking about. From the beginning, Tartt's work confused critics. The Secret History was greeted with a kind of wonder by writers, critics, and readers, not just because its author was a mysterious tiny package from Greenwood, Mississippi, who dressed in crisp, tailored suits and revealed little about herself, but because few could place it on the commercial literary continuum. So now, Chris, me talking to you, it was, oh, this kind of trashy genre novel is actually written so well that I don't know how to dismiss it or enjoy it. That's kind of
yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah.
And after The Little Friend didn't have the same kind of effect, The Goldfinch is like the return of the repressed. Everyone's like, okay, I know exactly how I feel now. This is genre fiction, and it's no good. Get out of my face.
Yeah, now I have enough data to confirm my opinion that this is garbage.
Yeah, Peretz quotes Grossman, Lev Grossman, who we talked about before. You couldn't classify it easily into high literature or genre fiction. It seemed to come from some other literary universe where those categories didn't exist, and it made me want to go to that universe because it was so compelling. And what we've discovered is that for a lot of folks in the literati or in the business of criticism and publishing, that's a universe that they don't want to exist, that they find deeply uncompelling, and they want people to stay away from it.
Yeah, so I guess I would just wrap things up here by saying, after doing all of this research, which I think this is going to be a big episode, probably close to 2 hours, and reading half of an 800-page novel.
You did well, Chris. You did well.
I did the best I could. I would say it seems to me that because there's so much controversy about it and there's so strong opinions on either side, that it seems like Tartt is doing something interesting in that it's generated this much conversation about it. As a writer, this is the least you could ask for, right? That like there's this many people engaging with your work and having strong arguments about it, and that they're using your work as a signifier, essentially, to define how the world works and what is valuable within it. You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @ChristianSager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.